The last thing my father ever said to me was that everything would be taken care of. I nodded and held his hand and told him not to worry. 3 weeks later, I was standing in the parking lot of the funeral home with nothing but the clothes on my back and a manila envelope my brother had just shoved into my chest. Inside that envelope was a will I had never seen before, and my father's signature on it looked nothing like his handwriting. I need to back up because you need to understand what kind of man my father was before you can understand what my brother did to him. What my brother did to me. What my brother and his wife had apparently been planning for longer than I had any idea. My father built his contracting business with his hands. Literally. He started with one truck, one toolbox, and a phone number he printed on business cards at the copy shop on Merchant Street. That was 31 years ago. By the time I was old enough to hold a hammer, he had 11 employees, 2 commercial accounts, and a reputation in our county that made other contractors refer clients to him when they were overbooked. He wasn't flashy about it. He drove the same Ford F-250 for 14 years. He packed his lunch every single day. He put every dollar he made back into the business or into the house he had bought for our mother when they were 26 years old. Our mother passed when I was 9 and my brother was 15. That changed things between the three of us in ways I didn't fully understand until much later. My father poured himself into work. My brother Derek poured himself into resentment. I was too young to see it at the time. I just thought that was how older brothers were. Distant. Cold. Always looking at you like you'd taken something from them. I started working with my father when I was 16. Summers first, then weekends, then full-time after I finished 2 years of community college, and my father sat me down and said he didn't need me to have a degree. He needed me to know the business. He was 53. He had been having chest pains he hadn't told anyone about yet. I think some part of him already knew. Derek had gone a different direction. He moved to Charlotte after college, got into commercial real estate, married a woman named Sasha who wore heels to backyard barbecues, and called our county quaint in a tone that made it sound like an insult. They came back for holidays. Derek shook my hand every time like we'd just met. Sasha air-kissed my father's cheek and spent most of every visit on her phone. I didn't hate them. I just didn't understand them, and I don't think they understood us either. For 9 years, I worked alongside my father. I learned how to bid a job, and how to manage a crew, and how to deal with a client who changed the specs halfway through a kitchen renovation, and then tried to blame you for the cost overrun. I learned his handshake deals, and his written contracts, and the difference between the two. I learned which suppliers would give you a break if you paid early, and which ones would bury a surcharge in an invoice if you didn't read carefully. My father paid me well. But more than the paycheck, he talked to me about the future. He told me the business was mine when he was ready to step back. He said it plainly, and he said it often. He told me the house was mine, too. The one on Caldwell Road where I had grown up and where he still lived, because he never wanted to leave it, and he never wanted me to have to leave it either. He said he had spoken to his attorney and everything was in order. He said Derek had his own life and his own money, and had never had any interest in the business anyway. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? These were not vague promises over dinner. These were specific, repeated, documented conversations between a man and the son who had spent nearly a decade learning everything he knew. What I didn't know was that Derek had started calling my father more frequently about 8 months before he died. My father mentioned it once, casually, said Derek seemed interested in reconnecting. I thought that was a good thing. I was glad. I told my father it was nice that Derek was reaching out. I had no idea what Derek was actually doing during those calls. My father's health declined faster than any of us expected. What started as fatigue turned into a diagnosis that turned into a prognosis that turned into a conversation no one wants to have. He spent his last 6 weeks in a hospice facility 20 minutes from the house. I was there every day. Derek flew in twice. Each time he stayed for 2 days. Each time he spent at least an hour alone with my father while I was in the cafeteria or the parking lot giving them space, because I thought that was the right thing to do. I thought my brother was making peace with our father. He was making plans. My father passed on a Tuesday morning in October. I was holding his hand. It was quiet, and it was slow, and it was the most painful thing I have ever sat through. The nurse came in and said what nurses say. I drove home and sat in the kitchen of the house on Caldwell Road for 3 hours without moving. Derek called that evening. He was sympathetic in the way that people are sympathetic when they are performing sympathy rather than feeling it. He said he would handle the arrangements. I said I could do it. He said no. He wanted to. He insisted, and I was exhausted and grieving, so I said fine. I should not have said fine. The funeral was 4 days later. It was a Thursday. The service was held at the same church where my parents had been married, where I had gone every Sunday as a child, where my father had served on the building committee for 11 years. The pews were full. My father's customers came. His suppliers came. His former employees came. Men in work boots and clean shirts who had known him for 20 years stood in the back because the seats were taken. I stood at the front and gave the eulogy. I talked about the truck and the toolbox and the business cards. I talked about his hands. I held it together until the last paragraph, and then I didn't apologize for it. What happened after the graveside service was when everything changed. We had all moved to the reception at the church hall. My father's neighbors had brought food. People were standing in clusters eating potato salad and telling stories about him. I was in the middle of a conversation with one of his oldest crew members when Derek touched my arm and said he needed to speak with me privately. We stepped into the hallway outside the hall. Sasha was already there, standing with her arms crossed, and that alone should have told me something. Derek didn't waste time. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope and handed it to me with an expression I can only describe as practiced. Prepared, like he had rehearsed this moment. He said our father had updated his will in August. He said the business and the house were being held in trust, and that he, as the older son, had been named the primary beneficiary and executor. He said there was a small provision for me. He named a number. The number was not small in the way that most people use the word, but it was small compared to what my father had built and what my father had promised. I opened the envelope. I looked at the document inside. I looked at the signature line. My father had very distinctive handwriting. He had learned to write with a heavy hand from his own father, and his signature had a particular loop on the capital letter of his last name that I had watched him make 10,000 times on invoices and contracts and birthday cards. The signature on this document did not have that loop. It was close, it was careful, but it was not right. I looked up at my brother. I said something was wrong. I said this didn't look like his signature. Derek said grief does things to your perception and that I needed to take some time before I made accusations. Sasha said nothing. She just watched me with the expression of someone waiting to see which way a car accident is going to go. I stood in that hallway holding a document that I was certain was fraudulent at my father's funeral reception, surrounded by people who had loved him, and I felt the floor shift under me in a way it had not shifted even when he died. I put the envelope under my arm. I walked back into the hall. I sat down at one of the tables and I stared at the door because I didn't know what else to do. And that is when she walked in. She was a woman I did not recognize. She was in her mid-50s, wearing a dark blazer, carrying a leather briefcase that looked out of place at a church reception. She paused just inside the doorway and scanned the room slowly, the way someone does when they are looking for a specific person and they know what they're doing. Her eyes landed on me and she walked directly to my table. She sat down across from me. She said her name was Patricia Hale. She said she was my father's estate attorney. She said she was sorry for my loss and that she had not planned to come today, but that she had received a call that morning from a colleague who had heard about the will Derek had been circulating and that she needed to speak with me before the end of the day. I told her I had just been handed a document in the hallway. She nodded like she had expected that. She said she knew. She set her briefcase on the table and opened it and removed a document that was immediately visually different from the one I was holding. Thicker. Notarized on multiple pages, dated the second week of September, 6 weeks before my father died, well after the date on Derek's version. She said my father contacted her in late August. He said he had been having conversations with his older son that concerned him. He said Derek had raised the topic of the business and the estate more than once in ways that felt probing. He said he wanted a new document drawn up immediately, fully witnessed and notarized, and he wanted it registered with her office and held there. He said he did not want any physical copy in the house. She said my father had told her explicitly that he was worried Derek might try to find and alter or replace any documents left at home. He had been right. Patricia set the new will on the table. I read it. The business, the house on Caldwell Road, the equipment, the accounts, My father's instructions were clear, detailed, and written in language that left no ambiguity. And his signature had the loop. I looked up and found my brother across the room. He was standing with a plate of food talking to one of my father's neighbors, completely at ease because he thought this was already over. Patricia said she needed me to understand what came next. She said the document Derek had presented was not just invalid. She said her office had already flagged inconsistencies in the notarization date and the witness signatures. She said one of the witnesses listed on Derek's version had died in March. She had the death certificate. She said her firm had also been reviewing bank records that my father had quietly shared with her in September, records showing that Derek had been granted limited power of attorney over one of my father's personal accounts during a period when my father was in the hospital for a preliminary procedure, and that during that window, 2 transfers had been made that my father had not authorized. She said she had already been in contact with the county sheriff's office. I sat at my father's funeral reception and listened to a woman I had never met tell me the complete shape of what my brother had done, and with every sentence the picture got larger and more deliberate and more devastating. This had not been opportunism. This had not been a moment of greed when my father got sick. This had been a campaign. The phone calls that started 8 months ago. The visits where he spent time alone with my father. The power of attorney obtained under the premise of helping with medical paperwork. The will drafted by someone, not Patricia, not my father's actual attorney, but someone who had done a careful but not careful enough job of mimicking my father's signature. Sasha had a background in real estate law. She had passed the bar in North Carolina 14 years ago and let her license lapse. She knew enough. She had known exactly enough. I asked Patricia how long my father had known what Derek was planning. She said she thought he had suspected for several months and confirmed it for certain in late August. She said he had been very calm about it when he came to her office. She said he told her he was not angry at Derek, that he had made peace with who his older son was, but that he was not going to let Derek take what belonged to me. She said he told her that the business was my life, and that he had watched me build it alongside him for 9 years, and that he was not going to let it be taken from me by someone who had never set foot on a job site. I had to stop her for a moment. I had to look away at the wall and take a breath that didn't fully work. When I looked back at the room, Derek was watching me from across the hall. I don't know when he had started. He was looking at the briefcase and at Patricia, and his expression had changed. The ease was gone. He said something to Sasha. She turned and looked. Her face went very still. Patricia was still talking. She was explaining the timeline for probate. She was explaining what the sheriff's office had told her about the investigation. She was explaining that the unauthorized transfers from my father's account constituted elder financial abuse under state statute, and that the forged will constituted fraud and forgery, and that both offenses carried significant criminal exposure. Derek set his plate down on a nearby table and crossed the room toward us. He stopped at the edge of our table. He looked at Patricia first and then at me. He said whatever she was saying, he wanted his attorney present before any further conversation happened. He said this calmly, but his voice had changed. The practiced ease had cracks in it now. Patricia looked at him without any particular expression. She said she was not there to speak with him. She said she was there to inform his brother of the existence and contents of the validly executed will that she had prepared and registered in September, and that her office had already been in contact with the appropriate parties. She said he was welcome to contact his attorney at any time. Sasha had come to stand next to Derek. She said nothing. She was a woman who had spent 14 years doing real estate deals, and she understood what the words appropriate parties meant in this context. The color in her face was doing something I had never seen it do before. My brother looked at me for a long moment. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the documents on the table weren't already saying. He turned and left. Sasha followed him. I watched them walk out through the side door of the church hall, and I thought about my father sitting across from Patricia in her office in September, 2 months before he died, calm and deliberate, making sure that even after he was gone, he could protect what we had built. I thought about him packing his lunch every day for 30 years. I thought about the loop in his signature. The days that followed were not easy. They were not supposed to be easy, and I did not expect them to be. There were attorneys, and there were meetings, and there were documents requiring my signature. And there were phone calls from Derek's lawyer making arguments that grew progressively less confident over the course of 3 weeks. There was a conversation with a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit who asked careful, specific questions about the power of attorney and the transfers and who my father had been in communication with during his final months. What came out through the investigation was more than I had already known, and what I already knew was already too much. Derek and Sasha had begun planning this in the spring. Sasha had drafted the fraudulent will herself, using her old legal knowledge and a template she had modified. The witness whose name appeared on it had been dead for 7 months when they signed his name. The notary's stamp had been obtained fraudulently through a contact Sasha had from her real estate days. The transfers from my father's account totaled just over $41,000, moved into an account they had opened for the purpose. They had intended the fraudulent will to be the document found and processed, while the real one, which they had not known existed because my father had kept it entirely out of the house, was never located. My father had outmaneuvered them from his hospital bed. The criminal charges came down 6 weeks after the funeral: forgery of a legal instrument, fraud, elder financial abuse. Sasha faced an additional charge related to unauthorized practice of law in connection with the will's preparation. The district attorney's office was not inclined to be lenient. My father had been well known and well liked in the county, and the circumstances of what had been done to him, to his estate, to his memory, were not the kind of facts that generate sympathy for a defendant. Derek's attorney entered into negotiations. There was a plea. Derek received 30 months, with eligibility for early release contingent on full restitution. Sasha received 18 months and a substantial fine. The $41,000 was recovered and placed back into the estate. Their assets were examined for any additional funds traceable to my father's accounts. There were some. Those were recovered too. I want to tell you that when I found out about the plea, I felt something satisfying and clean. I want to tell you the anger resolved into something peaceful. That's not exactly what happened. What happened was quieter and more complicated than that. I thought about my brother at 15, losing our mother, turning inward while I was too young to understand what was happening to him. I thought about every holiday where he shook my hand like a stranger, and every phone call that was too short, and every year of distance that became easier to maintain than the work of actually knowing each other. I thought about what it must have taken, what kind of bitterness had to accumulate for a decade or 2 decades, to arrive at a place where you would forge your dying father's signature on a document designed to take everything from your own brother. I thought about that, and I did not forgive him, and I did not feel sorry for him either. I just understood, finally and completely, that whatever had happened to Derek was something that had happened in him, not to him. My father had not done this to Derek. I had not done this to Derek. Derek had done this to Derek. And then he had done it to my father, and then he had tried to do it to me. The house on Caldwell Road is mine now. I still pack my lunch most days, which is something I realized I had picked up from my father without ever thinking about it. The truck I drive is newer than his, but not much. I kept most of his crew on. The ones who knew him best had a hard few months after he passed, and I tried to give them the space to feel that while still keeping the work running. Because that is what he would have done. Patricia Hale sent me a card when the probate process was finalized. Inside, she had written a single sentence my father had said to her in their September meeting. He'd been talking about me and the business and why it mattered that everything be handled properly, and he had said, "That boy puts everything he has into the work, and he deserves to keep what he built." I keep the card in the top drawer of the desk in the office on Caldwell Road, the same desk my father used for 20 years. The wood is worn smooth where his forearms rested, and the drawer sticks a little on the left side, which I have never fixed because fixing it would feel like removing something that belongs there. I think about him every day. I think about the loop in his handwriting. I think about him sitting across from a woman he had hired to protect me 2 months before he died, already gone enough that he needed a walker to get to her office, and still sharp enough, still careful enough, still enough of the man who had built everything from one truck and one toolbox to know exactly what needed to be done and to do it without telling anyone, without making a scene, without giving Derek the chance to counter it. He could not stop what was coming for him. He could not add years to his life, or change who his older son had become, or undo the losses that had bent their relationship into something neither of them had wanted. But he could sit down at a desk and sign his name the right way, the way he had always signed it, with the loop, and he could make sure that when the time came there would be someone in the doorway with a briefcase. He made sure that was who he was. That is who he will always be. And the business is still standing. The crew still shows up every morning, and the house on Caldwell Road still has his coffee mug on the second shelf of the cabinet where he always kept it, because I am not ready to move it, and I am not sure I ever will be.